Hello again, LSP. Continuing on with this Microphone Essential Review lecture, going to talk about the three basic types of microphones. There are more microphone engines out there than just these three, but these are the three in the common era that we use: dynamic, ribbon, and condenser. You are, of course, already familiar with these, so I will whip through them. Dynamic microphones, like the venerable SM58 that you see there in all sorts of awkward situations, are inexpensive, they're easy to construct, they're rugged, they tend to be used for cooking hot dogs. I don't know about that, but they can withstand stage use, being dropped or submerged in water or sweat or that sort of stuff. Pretty good for handheld microphone, rejection of noise, handling noise. They can handle high SBLs. They're great for guitar amps and snare drums, that sort of thing. And they're relatively resistant to feedback and leakage. That's kind of an interesting concept. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Whether they really are more resistant than condenser mics or not is kind of a complicated debate. But dynamic mics are very popular in live sound. If you have to use them on really quiet sources, think of finger-picked acoustic guitar playing very, very soft. It can be kind of problematic because they're not high output dynamic microphones, so you may need to put extra preamp gain on them on a quiet source, so that can be a limitation. If you want to use them with something that's very all about the high frequencies, cymbals, violins, acoustic instruments, they are restricted in frequency response. Specifically, the high end of dynamic microphones is not, highly articulate, and thus in studios, of course, condenser microphones are often preferred for that sort of thing. And in live sound, we have a variety of modern condenser microphones that are really great if you want to put them on cymbals and hi-hats and acoustic instruments, and often on the lead singer. Vocalists want to have that extra clarity that comes from a condenser mic. So, there is a limitation here with dynamics, but in most cases, it's something we can deal with. Condenser microphones are in many ways opposite. They have a very different engine inside of them. I won't talk about them in this review lecture, but they have less mass to move, so their high frequency accuracy is much greater. They're very popular for cymbals and, quality vocals, acoustic instruments, that sort of stuff. They have better high frequency response, and really specifically, they have better transient response. They're faster to respond, so they really can pick up those tiny little transients that come with cymbals and acoustic instruments. They have a built-in amplifier in them, often powered by phantom power. So this means less preamp gains, means they're typically quieter microphones, and less issues with background noise, or not background noise, but they're less preamp gains required. They can be a lot smaller. We can make really tiny microphones, which of course are very useful in all sorts of applications. Traditionally, condenser microphones are very fragile. This is why you didn't see big condenser tube microphones on the road in the old days. Today, modern condenser microphones are pretty robust. That's not really an issue. And condenser microphones may be more prone to feedback and leakage. They may have a looser polar pattern, which I'll talk about in a moment in a different slide, compared to dynamic microphones, whether that really is a thing or not. More details about condensers. I mentioned the transient response. Here's some slide here showing that a condenser microphone is more likely to respond to a quick and precise transient, perhaps you might get when you hit a cymbal with a stick, something you would do as a drummer. Whereas dynamic microphones are more likely to smear out the transient. We call that phase shift if you'd like. And this has everything to do with condenser mics have less mass to move. You don't have to move a coil or inside a magnet like you do with a dynamic microphone. You only have to move the capacitor element. So anyway, condenser microphones tend to be preferred. Do condensers have more leakage, or are they more likely to pick up feedback? This is certainly a wives' tale, or a concept most sound engineers have, that when they switch to condensers, they're more likely to pick up the drums behind them if you put them on a vocals, that sort of thing. We call it stage wash, leakage feedback. The condensers are more problematic. And I would argue that they actually have the same polar pattern as a dynamic, that they are not inherently more sensitive to background noise. It's really how we choose to use condensers. If a dynamic microphone, in this case a bar band, we're going to shove a 58 in a tenor saxophone bell. This is not the best place in the world to mic a saxophone. It sounds very honky in the bell. It's a very specific frequency range emanated from that part of the horn, but it's the loudest part. So if you really want to gain before feedback and you're on stage and you shove a mic in there, it's going to be the loudest part, and you're going to have to EQ the hell out of the microphone to make it work. Whereas if you want a more consistent microphone sound, you would pull a microphone back away from the saxophone. And in this case, you're now immediately going to be risking more gain before feedback, more leakage, all that sort of stuff. Or sorry, I said more gain, less gain before feedback, more leakage by moving the microphone farther from the source. It is, however, going to sound better and less EQ is going to be required. So here's my philosophy here, my thought here, is that when sound engineers want it to sound right, they switch to a condenser mic. It's not the condenser mic itself that's more prone to feedback and leakage. It's the microphone position that engineers who use condenser microphones choose. Does that make sense? That's the first reason I think why condenser microphones see more feedback is we tend to put them in a more humane, natural sounding position. The second reason, and this really applies to handheld vocal microphones, is that condenser microphones, the manufacturers actually put the diaphragm farther back into the body of the microphone than you would with a dynamic mic. And they do this because when the singer sings at their loudest, the electrical output of the condenser microphone can actually overload the internal electronics and distort them. And some microphones have a pad switch. Usually handheld mics do not, but nice studio condensers do. And, you can't ask the singer really to mess with the pad switch when they're going to sing loud. So anyway, what the manufacturers do is they move the diaphragm back a little bit. This prevents distortion and it also helps balance proximity effect quite a bit. It makes it so that it's more consistent in low end as they move their voice to and from around the microphone. So it makes the mic sound better to have the diaphragm move back. But it does mean less gain before feedback. It means more leakage and more feedback because the diaphragm is farther from the sound source and closer to the background noise. So, my philosophy, my thought, my theorem here is that, and I stole this from someone else, it wasn't my theorem, it was from Merlin Van Veen, that you're going to see more, the position of the diaphragm in a handheld condenser is really what's at the root here for additional background noise and potential for feedback.